Yeah, we're live. We're live. First Virgin voyage with the podcast. So I don't know. Do we do introductions or we just start this thing? What do you want to do?
I think we probably got to do a little bit of introductions, but
All right. So Jason Lohmeyer, artist and searcher of knowledge. And the reason I think that I wanted to do this podcast is to share ideas and maybe hopefully influence some people with things that we've learned, stuff that we've learned from books, experiences and stuff like that. And I'll let you introduce yourself.
yeah, Chad Renning, and I think again with you and I, the discussions we have, the talks that we have are always interesting, and I think we have good discussions. So I think just being able to share those discussions again with the idea of like, can we get better? Can we learn? Can we try to understand what's going on in the world, what's going on with people? And I just think it's kind of cool to be able to share that.
Yeah, you're such a better writer or thinker than I am.
I wouldn't go that far. I feel like I was stumbling all over myself.
I wish I could sound like that, but so we're going to talk about some books today, and this book that we're going to talk about first. Amazing. I mean, and the reason I found out about it is being an artist, I've just kind of learned just from experiences that the more time you put into painting or drawing or whatever, you just become better at it. And so I just kind of had that. No one really taught that to me, just kind of just an epiphany. And then I was talking to people at a wedding. I'd meet somebody. It might be a business person or it might be a teacher. And they would be like, I'd tell them my thing, like, like, did you always do this? I go, no, I just spent a lot of time doing it over years. And they're like, oh, it's the 10,000 hour rule. It's what Malcom Gladwell talks about. And so I'm like, who's Malcom Gladwell? So just a lot of people kept referring me to the book. I don't even know if I had talked to you about it yet until I started reading it. And I got the book, started reading it, and it blew me away with kind of some things that I just, some aha moments and just some validity with, some of his research and stuff like that. So first thing that I want to talk to you about, Chad, and we kind of discuss and then just go back and forth. But the thing that I loved about it was it gave specific example. So the one that really stuck out was the Bill Gates kind of story. And again, and even kind of going to the end of the book where Gladwell talks about why he wrote the book. And it was because people would always say to him, oh, Bill Gates is only successful because, he had drive. And what Gladwell's trying to say is, no, that's one of the reasons, but there's these other factors. So it's that idea of culture. And I just kind of skimmed through it again today. I started reading, I have ADD, so I started reading the book. I started reading other books, and I get on these art projects. And then so I kind of went back and reread some of the earlier parts that were a while ago. And you probably remember this too, but Bill Gates, he's growing up in Washington, like blocks from Washington State University. And so if actually not Washington State, University of Washington, sorry. Huskies.
Go Dogs.
Yeah.
Yep.
So he's able to sneak out at night and go like get on the computer and code like for hours. And so by the time he gets to high school, he's this like, he spent 1,000 hours that people, even some other universities don't even have that access. So I thought that was pretty amazing that where he grew up played a huge role in him being successful.
Yeah, it's funny. I remember, so I read this book, but it has been several years since I read it. And I do love Gladwell, and I think we're going to talk about another one of his books later. But he has some of those similar themes. And what I remember is thinking about like the idea of nurture versus nature type stuff. And I think like you said it well, the idea that like it's not one, it's not one thing, it's many things. And like he had the drive, you said he had the desire, but he also had like the opportunity where he almost just got lucky that's where he lived, that's where he grew up, that somebody was going to allow him to go and work on these machines that nobody else had access to. And I think it is with those outliers, like he talks about, is like so much has to go right for it to work. And I think like sometimes we overlook that idea that you can work as hard as you want, you can be as dedicated as you want, but if you get a bad break, that could set you way back, or vice versa. Is you get a break somebody else doesn't get, it can vault you ahead. So I don't know. I just think it's an interesting idea, and I think he's an interesting person to look at from that way.
Yeah, and if you think of like sports, I remember the Kurt Warner story. Guys like at a grocery store, and somehow he makes it, and it's like just these stories at the right place at the right time, and then he has the drive, and then he becomes like this legend. Wins Super Bowl. There's people out there at the grocery store right now that
Yep.
play in the National Football League or do some feat, whether it's in academia or the sports world, but they're kind of their culture or whatever they decided didn't give them those opportunities.
And I wonder with stories like that too, like there's so many more people who don't make it, right? Because there's that guy who's bagging the grocery who maybe is just as good a quarterback as Kurt Warner, but he's never got a shot, right? And I think sports is a good example of that. Is you see kids in college who are just awesome, and they hurt their knee, or they get into drugs, or they get drafted even by the wrong team, or they've got family issues. Like all that stuff can really derail you. So it's just kind of amazing.
Yeah, we were talking. Was talking to some high school athletes, kind of about like what kind of injuries they've had, and these kids at 16 years old have already torn ACLs and NCLs, and it's crazy how what you're more probably into sports than I am, but like what is in baseball? I know you can go a little longer, but what age in baseball are you kind of done? And I know football, it's usually like 30, you're over the hill. But when baseball, What's your life expectancy as far as physical injuries?
And I think it just kind of depends. Typically, guys can play a little bit longer, but shoot, we see Tom Brady, who's 43, still playing football. So
that's rare. I mean, that's
for sure.
Talk about how rare that is. And so that's where if you're spending your 10,000 hours in sports, your window is so small, and you get one injury, you're done. Whereas look at Gates and Steve Jobs and Paul Allen, they all invested their time into their brain. And not everyone had those opportunities, but at least it's not like an injury is going to derail you, at least a physical. So.
It's funny too, and I actually just started a book. It's called Range, and he's building on the idea of is it better to generalize, where you try to be good at a bunch of different stuff, or do you get real specific? And he used, and I just got through the first chapter this morning, but he used Tiger Woods and Federer as examples, as Tiger Woods was somebody who played golf since he was 2 years old, nothing but golf, all he did there. And Federer's he played soccer, and he swam, and he played karate, and he golfed, and he played tennis, and he did all these other things, and both of them ended up the best athletes in their sport, but they all took different routes. And this book's kind of examining what's better. So that's the next one. That's what I'm reading now.
I'd like to hear the outcome of that, because my cousin, he from the age 3 had a basketball in his hand, and he was so good. He wasn't that great at other sports, but basketball was his thing. He actually got a scholarship to Air Force, and then he injured his ankle freshman year, and then he was on the bench and he quit. He was like, I just don't want to do it anymore. And at that point, that was his sport. That was kind of his thing. So you're right, kind of like putting all your eggs in one basket. And then if it doesn't go well, then you're kind of like, that's it,
What else you got to do, right?
Yeah. So it was interesting. I was kind of going over my notes with someone today, and they said they didn't believe, or they believe things were meant to be. I was kind of talking about Bill Gates, and I go, no, he was just meant to be there. And I don't know. I think because Gladwell is talking about luck, right?
Right.
And I saw her point. She was like, well, he was meant to be there. He was meant to go to that. I'm like, I don't know. It was an interesting conversation. But I could see that perspective, but I truly believe that people, even when you're in that situation, you have to have the drive, which they did for sure. So I want to run some quotes by you before we get into your book. So this is at the end of the Outliers, and Malcom Gladwell writes, the outlier in the end is not an outlier at all. They are products of history and community, of opportunity and legacy. So he's almost, his book Outliers is almost saying they're not outliers. They're just lucky kind of, and he says in there, don't get me wrong, you have to have ambition, but without the culture in the community, they're not outliers. Like it's all together, which is pretty fascinating because I never thought.
Really fascinating. And I love that quote. I've never heard that. And I couldn't agree more with him. And it's funny when you talk about that idea of like, was it like meant to be? Is it some kind of like divine intervention? He was supposed to be there, that kind of stuff. I think it's like, it's a culmination of just all these different events that kind of come together. And I think they come together for some people, but they don't come together for all people. And I just think it's less about, I guess, who you are, right? Or I'm trying to think what it's
do you remember
everything, right?
Todd Marinovich?
I do.
So we grew up a huge football fan like you, had all the football cards, and I remember having his rookie card and didn't know anything about him. As a kid, you're just like, oh, he's a Raider.
Yeah.
And he lasted a couple years, and someone told me he was doing art, so I actually Googled him a couple years ago, and he's like the street artist. He does like artwork in California. But I was reading the story. Did they do a 30-30 for him?
They did. I think they did. They either did a whole movie or just an episode or something, but there was a story about it.
Okay. So I never saw it. I just kind of researched and kind of looked up some articles, and I guess his parents were almost trying to make him an outlier. They like had him doing a medicine ball at age 3. He wasn't allowed to find sugar. He had to bring like his own cupcakes to kids' parties. And he was this athletic specimen. He had all these records in high school, but then he gets to college and he's like snorting coke. I think he got to the NFL. He got busted for drugs, and then all of a sudden, I read, he was like homeless, like skateboarding, and like in California, he's getting arrested for graffiti. It might not be graffiti, but he got arrested for something, and it's crazy. Like, so he had the culture, he had the athletic stuff, but I'm not saying he didn't have a desire, but because maybe you just get kind of addicted to things.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to like you're saying about that, putting all your eggs in one basket. Like he put all his eggs in one basket, and it might not even be him that put all those eggs in the basket. Like it sounds like it was his parents, right? That said, you're going to do this. We're going to make you do this and all this kind of stuff. And it just wasn't what he wanted ultimately. And again, we're probably speaking for him, that we probably shouldn't be speaking for him, but that's what the perception is, right? That wasn't what he wanted. It was almost forced on him. And then when he didn't have football, like he didn't really have anything, right?
Maybe we can get him on the podcast.
Call him up.
Yeah,
he was the artist connection.
The last thing I read, he was coaching a team, like I don't think it's called semi-pro, but it's like people that don't get paid to play football.
I think it's technically semi-pro, but whatever. It's old guys, right? Old guys that just love to play.
I think he was quarterbacking or coaching. I'm not sure which one it was, but that's kind of what he was up to. All right, so last thing before we go. So I was thinking a lot about Gladwell's saying it's your community, your culture. So how do you provide that culture for your children or yourself? Like if that's true, right? Like, and he talks about like your parents, but now both of us are adults, both have children. Like how do we create this culture? I guess we don't want to put all their eggs in one basket.
Yep.
Right. Keep yourself trained, but at the same time, you got to start spending those hours into something.
Yeah. See, and I'm almost the other way. Like, I think like exposure, and giving them opportunities in everything is probably like the way I'm trying to do it, right? That it's like, shoot, you want to do karate? Let's do karate. You want to do basketball? Let's do basketball. You want to do art stuff? Let's do art stuff. Like just trying to expose them to as many things as possible.
And then I guess at some point, as they start to get older, then they develop the passion, and then they kind of
be able to find it. And even there, like it could be into like our age, right? There could be things that we find in our age that we want to do, whether it's writing or like photography or that kind of stuff. Like I think sometimes we try to rush into that stuff too often. Like we feel like a kid has to decide in high school that they want to be a carpenter, or they want to be a teacher, or whatever it is. Like sometimes I think we force that too early. So that's going to kind of be my approach, I guess. But I don't know.
Think about it. You're in college and they're like, oh, we got to pick a major.
Yep.
I do it. Time to pick your major. And you just kind of, okay, I'll do this. And then, sometimes you get sidetracked into another thing, but you kind of have to decide at a young age. And it's crazy. I keep thinking back to what Gladwell said, where it was the Bill Gates part, but he said, like if Bill Gates was born 10 years earlier, he doesn't become who he is. And if he was born 10 years after he doesn't. He was like born at the perfect window. I think it was 1975, like the world's first mini computer kit was like made, and he was like 21. And if he's like too young, he probably doesn't have the money or the hours. And if he was born, like if he's our age, then he's probably like, am I already working, whatever.
Right, I've got my typewriter.
Yeah, because he was right at that age, and it just was like perfect opportunity. So like now what someone, if they wanted to be an outlier, like what right now is their time? I don't know if it's social media, maybe that's already
past. Yeah, it's probably like artificial intelligence stuff, or like I don't know. It's
right.
Kind of
exactly what the next step is and stuff. And I like every all these third graders, and they're on their phones and they're doing all this stuff, like they're building all these hours of like dexterity or whatever, like, and who knows, maybe when they're 15, 20, they're going to just have these like extra digits on their hands.
They're going to be hunched over and that kind of stuff. It's funny you say even that about like the time he was born in, but it's also like you said, the location that he was born in, right? That if he was maybe a mile down the road, maybe it doesn't even like happen that way, or like the opportunity, like the family that he's born into, and they had money.
They did. They went they pulled him out of public school, put him into a private school. And then the mother's club or whatever had the money to buy a computer. That doesn't happen. They were saying at that point, and he's in, I think, 8th grade or 6th grade, he's programming when some colleges couldn't even do it.
Right.
Like that, that was crazy. And then
there's just so many of those variables.
Yeah, and then Steve Jobs, just a little quick thing on him, in case you haven't read the book, people out there kind of listening. Definitely recommend the book. It's awesome. But one of what he was talking about Gates, and he talks about Steve Jobs, and Steve Jobs was getting like spare parts from Bill Hewitt of Hewlett Packard, and like from the computer. And that he Gladwell kind of like likens that to if you were into fashion design, it was like growing up next to Giorgio Armani. Like that's just, what are the chances of that, right? So again, you're into basketball and your neighbor's Michael Jordan. He's showing you like tips and tricks. So again, you have to have the environment. But I do want to mention this because we got a lot of people out there listening maybe that are going to be like younger, and they're kind of thinking about what they want to do and what they want. You have to have that passion part. And I don't know if I told you this story, but basically I met an artist. I was trying to get into, I was going to do illustration. I did that for a little while, and then now I've been doing more of the fine art. But when I was trying to get into illustration and meet people and connections, I met an illustrator, author. I just asked him for advice, and he said, you have to procrastinate. You have to be willing to be more than the person trying to get the job. And he told me a story of, he's friends with Todd McFarlane, the guy who made Spawn and does those. They're not the little ones we had.
They're the like figurines. They're like
not the ones we had, but the bigger ones that are really detailed. I can't remember. Okay. Are they McFarlane Sports Things or whatever? But anyways, Todd McFarlane, just a millionaire. He's definitely got a lot of different things going on. Well, this guy that's telling me a story is friends with Todd McFarlane, and he has a friend who's a really good artist. And this guy, just as good as he is, and the guy I'm talking to, I cannot remember his name. I'll get his name, but he's basically written books. He's has his own comic books. He has his own illustration company, and he's got this friend who's just as good at drawing, but never kind of always procrastinates, whatever. So they set up a meeting with the friend who's kind of the aspiring artist with Todd McFarlane to ink his comics, and it's like $200,000 a year. It's a really good gig. And they're all telling this guy who's always kind of procrastinating, this is your chance. You're living next to Giorgio Armani, right? And you're the fashion designer. So McFarlane tells the guy, okay, you have like 3 months. And it's been a while since I heard the story, but it's something along the lines. You have 3 months. You have to have 60 drawings, and we'll meet, and then we'll go over it. So he starts working on them. And the guy telling me the story checks in with him about a month in. He goes, hey, how are you? Halfway done. He goes, oh, I haven't really started yet. Just like, and he's like, this is your chance. You got to do this. This is like, And the time comes, he goes to meet with McFarlane, and he walks in, and he only has like 10 done, and he's supposed to have like 30. And Todd McFarlane goes, "No thanks, thanks, but no thanks." And
Right.
the guy telling me the story said, "Don't be like my friend, like just do it." And so that's where you go. You not only do you have to have that culture, right, but you have to have that drive, and you have to have certain things. Now, maybe that guy's culture, or however he was raised, he didn't have that that willingness or dedication or true grit, whatever. But anyways, I thought that was an interesting.
And yeah, you wonder like where that comes from too, because I know you and I talking about teaching about like holding kids to deadlines, like even something like that. If he didn't have that drive, because he's like, they asked me for 30, I can bring 10 and it'll be fine, right?
Right.
When it's like, shoot, no, you got to meet expectations at the very least. But
right. All right, tell us about is it Talking to Strangers?
Talking to Strangers, yeah. So it is also another Gladwell book, and this is actually the first book I did on like an audiobook, which I thought was really cool. And
so you didn't really read it.
Didn't read it. I just listened to it. So, but the one thing I like is Gladwell does with his audiobooks, this is kind of a little bit of a tangent, but it's more like a podcast, where anytime he takes like a quote from somebody, he actually lets them use their voice. So like he interviewed them, and he pulls the quote and he uses the audio quote, and then he mixes in like music, and he does like news story snippets and that kind of stuff. So that's like awesome. Yeah, and I didn't realize
Gladwell's voicing it.
Gladwell's reading it. Yep. And then he would be talking about somebody, and then he had an interview with them, and their voice would come in where he said, and then their voice would come into it. And I didn't realize that's not common in audiobooks, because I just started listening to this other one that I can't remember what it's called, Range. And it's somebody else's reading, and it's very like monotone. It's very
I've listened to one audiobook and I loved it, but it wasn't the author, and it was very like monotone. And I go, oh, this is what an audiobook. So that's shocking that Gladwell's actually.
And so I think I got spoiled listening to that one first. Yeah.
Yeah, this one I'm like, before you spend $15-$30 on your next audiobook, you might want to read the reviews just in case.
Yeah, no, for sure. But so basically he starts with this premise of, so there's this lady, I'm pretty sure her name was Sandra Bland, and she was living in Chicago, and she moved down to, or was going to move down to outside of Houston. It was in like Prairie View, Texas. She gets pulled over by a cop. They get kind of into it a little bit. She gets arrested, and she's in jail, and she ends up killing herself in jail. And he's like examining like why it turned out so bad, like this almost like innocent encounter. She got pulled over for not using a signal, turns into her, like he loses his job. She ends up dead, killing herself, and like why did it end up that way? So he kind of goes with the premise of like, we're bad of talking to people we don't know, that we're just bad at communicating and trying to understand and listen to people. And he goes through, and it's kind of cool because he goes through and he takes different examples, kind of like with Outliers, but he takes different examples and like highlights different areas that went wrong. So like one of them's the Amanda Knox story, and I don't know how much you remember about that. I didn't really know a whole lot about it.
Dateline.
Yeah. But so she was this American who was like doing a study abroad in Italy, I think.
A murder.
So her roommate ends up murdered, and her and her boyfriend basically get accused of it. And she had nothing to do with it and that kind of stuff. But he kind of goes with the realm of like, she was just a different person. So like when the cops were interviewing her, like she was kind of like a happy person.
Yeah.
And they're like, well, that's weird. Your roommate just died. Why are you happy? Like, so,
I hate
go ahead.
when you do that. I watch a lot of Dateline and documentaries, and they always interview the husband or whatever, and they always say, like, if the husband's like happy like that, they're always like, oh, it's odd, you're acting really happy. And then if the husband doesn't say anything, they're like, oh, it's odd, he's not showing any emotion. And then if he's like crying, it's like, oh, he's too emotional. Like, what are you supposed to be? Like, how are you supposed to act?
And that's
like, his right or wrong.
Yeah, and that's his point. Like, he's like, there's no, like, we all respond to things differently. But he's like, there's this general consensus that like you have to be this way or that way. And he calls it transparency, that people aren't as transparent as we think they are. And he kind of, he uses the show Friends to kind of say, well, we watch all this TV, and with TV, they're always totally transparent. Like you watch a TV show and you can read the faces and know exactly how they feel. But then when you interact with people, like we're not like that. We don't, like if we're happy, we don't always have this giant smile on our face and walking around with a bunch of energy. Like some people, when they're happy, they're still introverted. They're not necessarily smiling. So he kind of talks about those, and I'm trying to remember. So, and then he talks about like this idea of coupling, that things aren't always like one. And I'm trying to think how to best explain it, but he uses the idea of suicide, and that this idea that if somebody wants to kill themselves, like they're going to find a way to kill themselves. And he kind of pushes back against that like people have to be almost like we're talking in a right situation, right? And he used the Golden Gate Bridge as an example, where he talks about all these people go and commit suicide at the Golden Gate Bridge every year, and it's taken them 100 years to build like a net underneath it.
Wow.
Because people always argued that, well, if somebody doesn't jump off the Golden Gate Bridge, they're just going to go find another way to do it. And he argues that that's not true. That he said typically like it's somebody in a bad moment, right? That just is in this opportunity and they make that decision. Because he actually went through where it was like 100 people who had tried to jump off the Golden Gate Bridge and didn't die. And he said only somebody like 6 or 8 of them actually went and committed suicide again or tried to again.
But most of them after that first attempt, they were like, they got their senses.
Yeah, they're like, all right, it was just like I was in a bad moment, it was a bad place, like, and they didn't go and try it again. So like he ties that into like there's certain things that are tied to other things. It's not always like a one-to-one. He's also talks about people and like our default to truth and whether or not that's a good thing. As he talks about how people are trustworthy for the most part, that we're going to assume that people are telling us the truth. And he kind of gets into like, what would a world be like if we didn't default to truth, if we always were suspicious of everybody, and the like the positives and the negatives of that. But it's just really cool because he uses a bunch of different stories, and now I'm blanking on some of the other ones where he uses like the Bernie Madoff stuff. So he was the guy who like mismanaged a bunch of people's money, where he did a Ponzi scheme where he takes people's money and says he's investing it, and then he's kind of paying them off little by little, but he's using that money for other things and basically not investing it. And
right.
He told a story about this Cuban intelligence officer that was embedded in the CIA for decades, and nobody in the CIA knew that they were a Cuban intelligence officer.
Wow.
And getting all kinds of American secrets and all this stuff, and was able to fool people for so long. And but just uses all these instances of where like people we don't know, we're just not good at understanding them or communicating with them. And then he takes all these different kind of ideas and it's all rolled up into this Sandra Bland, and they all kind of come to a head there, which is kind of cool because he starts with it and then he goes on all these smaller stories that are really interesting, and then he ends with her. And like the thing I got out of it was just like how how like I guess accepting you have to be, or understanding you have to be of us, like not being so critical of one another, whether we know the person or not. Like it's a lot easier if you know somebody to care about them and that kind of stuff, but kind of having those same interactions with people you don't know. But I don't know.
Well, and I think there's just so many different personality types too. You know, like introverts and outgoing. I mean, like my father-in-law, you can walk into a room and meet 10 new friends and try to sell them something, you know. And I'm like, I don't do well in large crowds. I like to have like 3 people I know, and so I don't know, like that. I get it too. Like, you know, if I get pulled over by a cop, I'm gonna act differently than you are.
For sure.
I'm gonna act differently than somebody on the East Coast will, you know, or what have you. So no, I'm excited to read that book, or listen to it either way. And then
I'm giving up reading.
yeah, so it's hard to read. I find with work and hobbies and, you know, raising a kid, like it is. And then I'm ADD, so like I'll start reading. If I read a book and I get into it, I don't want to put it down. But if I put it down for like 3 days, I'll go, oh, I forgot about that book. And then I'll try to read a little bit more, and I have to take notes. If I don't take notes, I forget a lot of, you know, things like that. So I kind of have a bookmark and I keep notes in there.
Right. I love that. And it's funny, I'm the same way. If I sit down and read for more than 5-10 minutes, I fall asleep. Like if I sit down for too long, I'll fall asleep. So the audiobook's actually been good because I go on walks in the morning and just listen to them on my walk.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I'm actually asking my wife for Christmas for some, I still have the headphones with the cord, and
Ooh.
yeah, I know. They are noise canceling, but they've got the cord, and I try to listen to some podcasts. I'm a big fan of the Joe Rogan podcast. And I try to listen to it on my walks, and I get up like at 4:20, and I walk with the dogs, and it's just cold or whatever, and it helps me, you know, listen. But that cord keeps falling out, or the dog, and then my phone flies off and hits the rocks. She said she would buy them for me for Christmas. Noise canceling, Bluetooth headphones.
Cool.
So I'm excited.
I got a couple Bluetooth that they were just cheap ones, but they work great. So
okay, good. Yeah, she was trying to read reviews. I used to be a real tech guy, and now I don't nothing. And so she was kind of reading some of the higher end ones and the lower end ones. And you know, those reviews, you never can trust them because
never know.
This microphone that I'm using, I read like 5 reviews. Oh, it's good. It's a good entry level podcasting microphone, and then it's a crap. Don't buy it. Like, so like you can't. I mean, every single thing I own things I've bought with had terrible reviews by some people and good reviews, and they're great products, you know. And then I bought things where I had great reviews, and then, you know, broke on me, you know, the first time where it didn't work. So yeah. But no, I'm excited to listen to some more podcasts, audiobooks. Speaking of that, I know we're both fans of Joe Rogan podcast. I actually, before we did this, I actually went and watched his very first podcast on
Ooh.
YouTube. We watched it. His very first one, number 1.
No. Is it good?
Yeah. So, and I just found it now. He's got 10 million subscribers now. Now he has 10 million subscribers.
Crazy.
So I just decided finally, you know, and I found him probably like 4 years ago. I knew he was a comedian, but I didn't know he had a podcast. And I'm a big Steve Rinella. He's a author, hunter. He has this show called The Meat Eater where he writes books, but so he's very well spoken, but he does a hunting show, and he's not like most hunting shows where they're like, yeah, I got a deer, and they're like, he's calm and he's creative. So I like his show, and I was just searching and I saw he was on this Joe Rogan. I go, Joe Rogan, is that comedian? So I found him probably like, I want to say 4 years ago, and I only listened to those 2 podcasts or 3 podcasts with Rinella, and then he was interviewing a lot of MMA guy. I'm not really an MMA guy, but MMA fighters and stuff. And then just recently I got into him again. So I went back to the original, very first number 1. It is so bad. And then the comments were the best because it's all people now going back and commenting, and some of the comments were, this podcast will never last.
No, you showed them.
Yeah, well, there was guys now just making fun of it. It wasn't.
Oh, I gotcha.
And then I guess at one point they said, they go, Rogan, I guess 100 people were watching that episode or whatever, and Rogan got all serious. Whoa, 100 people. That's like a Comedy Store. That's like a whole group. So I think he kind of knew he was onto something back then. But yeah, it's hey, we're light years ahead of where he was. So maybe in 10 years we'll have maybe 10 subscribers.
I don't think I want that, because I was going to ask you that question in the Outlier. Like, would you want to be one of those outliers? I don't know if I would.
Yeah.
Because even they're like, would you want to be Joe Rogan? I don't think I would want to be Joe Rogan.
I don't want to be Joe Rogan. You know me, I'm into the fine art. Trying to get some paintings in. It's like I don't really want, it's crazy. People are going to hear this and think I'm crazy, but I don't want more money. It's weird. I don't want more money. I'm comfortable with how much we make, provide, put food on the table. I can go to vacation when I want to go on vacation. But I do want to have art. Like, I want to be remembered for something. So, like, I guess I don't need to be an outlier, but I want people to look back and if it's a history book or a museum, like my artwork's somewhere there. I don't want my art to be at the Goodwill. And I figure nothing wrong with Goodwill, but I want my art to be good enough, or at least widely known. So I guess doesn't have to be fame, but that's kind of what I want. Last thing, I know we're gonna try to keep these to an hour, right?
Yeah.
So, in the art world, there are outliers, at least in Western art, which I'm doing. But there are outliers, and it's interesting to kind of dissect them. And a lot of them, their parents were artists. So I'm starting to see what Gladwell's talking about. Not only did they like art, but they had this cult, like one of my favorite artists, he was doing oil paints at age 8 in his dad's studio because his dad's an artist. I didn't do oil paints till I was 23, and I didn't know what I was doing. And I had some crazy stories in the college, the art world in the college of art, fine art. So it's just like that person, that individual had a jump start on me or other people. So that helped them be an outlier. Is that just that nurturing, that the experiences like you're talking about, like
for sure.
If I would have been born into an artist household where I'm painting at age 8, who knows where am I talking to you right now? Who knows? So,
probably not.
You don't. Yeah.
And that's why I think that book I'm reading, that range, I think gets into a lot of that. So I'm excited to get more into that, because I think that's what they're talking about is what's the better route, what's the more efficient route or effective route.
Awesome.
Because there's the artists that get burned out. Their parents are, I don't say forcing them, but you get burned out on art because that's what your parents do. Like,
right.
But I don't know. Yeah. But I'm excited for that.
I'm excited to talk about more books, and we'll talk about some other stuff too. Maybe aliens. Maybe I don't know. We can do whatever. I think the big thing is like just kind of reaching out to people that want to learn about stuff that maybe books that can change their lives or help them be successful, or whatever it is. But there's a book I'm really excited to read. I gotta focus. I got the Coyote book I was telling you about.
Yeah, I want to read that at some point.
So we can exchange them, and then we can talk about it on the podcast. But so I've got the Coyote book, but it's a book called Human Corn. Human Corn. Now, I'm so excited to read this book. My uncle, who died a couple of years ago, I was in college, and he goes, Jason, you have to read. He had checked it out from the library. I go, what's it called? Goes, Human Corn. And I'm like, what are you talking about, human corn? And it's basically, it's not like a Gladwell, storytelling. It's more of a, what would you call it? An academia book. It's very just like, here's what we found. Here's the documentation. Here's the research. So some of the reviews said it was very dry, but I read just the first page. I'm going to save it until I get done with some of these other ones. But basically, it's talking about evidence that human sacrifice or humans eating other humans in North America, pre-Columbian times. And it's just through like data and trash piles they go through, and they found like bones that they think were being processed, human bones that were processed like animal bones. So it's really interesting. It's very controversial because a lot of people don't believe that. And so it's, what do you believe, the science or the, it's really interesting. So I'm excited to read it, and I'll share that maybe on a podcast going up, a Human Corn. And it's hard to find. You had to pay like
really?
$40 for it online. So better be worth it. All right, buddy. Hey, thanks so much.
Yeah, it's good fun.
Yeah, so hopefully we'll drive them once a week. If not, we'll try to get them on there as often.
Do it. Yeah, do it when we can, and it's always a pleasure talking to you. Always good discussion. So
awesome.
Friday tomorrow, buddy. We're almost there.